So, dear participants here in the room and also online, a very warm welcome to all of you, and a special welcome to His Excellency Mr. White, the Ambassador of Ireland, his administration attaché, Ms. Ruth Dixon, and the humanitarian specialist and third secretary, Ms. Sarah Finn. It's an honor to have you here this afternoon. So today we will discover and discuss a new book which tells the story of two Irishmen and their friendship. Seán Lester, the last Secretary General of the League of Nations, and Edward Phelan, the fourth Director General of the ILO. It is actually the right moment because 100 years ago, in these September days, Ireland became a member of the ILO and of the League of Nations. This book is a very special contribution to the historical research on the ILO and the League of Nations. And the author is Gerry Finnegan. You all know him now, who has come all the way from Ireland to be with us this afternoon. Gerry is a native of Belfast in the north of Ireland and started with the ILO in 1988. And he managed first projects in Zambia and in Guyana. From 1994 to 2000, he joined the South Asia and then East Asia multidisciplinary teams. This was with Han Sen at the time, yeah. Before coming back to Geneva, then to lead the ILO's women's entrepreneurship development activities. And then you returned to Zambia as a director of the Lusaka office for Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia, until your retirement in 2010. But this was not an end. It was just a change of activities. You continue to work as a consultant for WHO, UNIDO, the World Bank, and of course for us as well. We have also with us Kari Tapiola, former Deputy Director General, with whom I have been working for many years now, especially for the ILO centenary in 2019. And he has accompanied the creation of this book and is certainly an expert on Edward Phelan. After Gerry's presentation, Kari will present his comments and thoughts and also some questions. Gerry's book is based on solid archival research. Therefore, I'm really happy that my colleague Remo Becci participates today in this panel. He's the head of the ILO archives and a much appreciated source of institutional knowledge for all historians working on the ILO, but also for all the colleagues interested in the ILO history. Remo has brought some treasures from the archives. I won't say more here. After his intervention, we will open the floor to questions. So those who participate online, they can put the question in the chat box, and then we read it to Gerry. Finally, just a few words about myself. I'm responsible for historical research here in the ILO, and I'm member of the ILO Research Department, which is organizing this event. On this occasion, I would like to transmit the sincere greetings of Richard Simons, the director of the research department, who cannot join this afternoon because he's in a very important tripartite meeting on the Global Coalition for Social Justice. So scheduling issues. Thank you very much to my colleague Sarah over there and Alessandro, who helped preparing this event. Before handing over to Gerry, I would like to say just a few words on the place of this book in the blossoming research on ILO history. At first, I must say I was a bit skeptical because it's about a time period we all know very well by now, especially the interwar period and the war years. And it focused also on two well-known personalities. Having read the book, I must admit that I have gained some new insights. Through the lens of the friendship between Lester and Phelan, Gerry gives a very personal account of the two first organizations of our multilateral system and of their struggle to survive in turbulent times. The book contributes certainly to a better understanding of the relation between the two dimensions, the national and the international dimension. And both Phelan and Lester experienced the tension between national loyalty and the interest of their government on one hand, and the international commitment and engagement on the other hand. These tensions actually shape the work and life of the first high-level international civil servants, because in those years, member states were still hesitant about the potential of the ILO and the League of Nations. The book certainly contributes to the research on small states. The international arena offered to smaller states opportunity for influence and recognition. And despite the dominant role of the big powers, there's quite some literature on small states, but it's more from a national perspective. What is missing, and I just want to mention this, is a comprehensive historical study on small states in the ILO. The book is a double biography. Biographical studies have their place in historical research. Also, the trend right now is more to give more visibility to actors who are less well-known, especially women, for instance, in international organizations. But we all know that in the ILO, the director generals play a very important role. So new research always makes sense. Gerry's book adds more detail and color to the good knowledge we have on Phelan already, but there are new elements. Biographical research is certainly a major contribution to the history of networks and social interaction, which I personally find very interesting how this has worked. And Gerry's study provides some insight into these diplomatic networks and the social habits and lifestyle of the international community in those years. It draws attention to the importance of friendship and trust for the functioning of international organizations, especially in moments of competition and struggle. And the end of the Second World War was certainly such a dramatic moment, which puts the friendship of the two men really at a root test. Finally, in bringing two men and two organizations together in one book, we learn a lot about the relation between the League of Nations and the ILO, the tensions, the competition, but also the collaboration. And so this is also, I would say, I found this very interesting to learn more through these two individual lives. I will end here and just say, in the current geopolitical situation, and you are certainly following what is going on in New York at the moment, a situation which in many ways resembles the 1930s, the book is certainly food for thought for all of us who want the United Nations and the ILO to continue to play their role. And with this now, I hand over to Gerry.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dorothea. I'm delighted to be back in Geneva, seeing some familiar faces, seeing some new faces, people who I've been communicating with on email and so on. Indeed, Ambassador Noel White, we've been in touch. I'm delighted that you're here along with your colleagues. Before I get into my talk, this is my kind of one opportunity to thank a few people, because the writing process has taken a long time. The former Director General, Guy Ryder, gave my book its blessing from its inception. Gerry Tapiola, former Deputy Director General, has been a valuable support in correcting and commenting and adding to my earlier drafts. Thank you, Gerry. Jacques Rodriguez in the ILO archives has been ever present in responding to my questions and my requests. And a big thank you to him and to his chief, Remo Becky. Dorothea, who of course you know by now, she has been working tirelessly in planning for this event. And my book would not have been possible without the fabulous support of Fiona Rowland and the ILO network of friends. She's actually on leave at the moment in Montreal, checking out Phelan, who was there many years ago. Email correspondence with Fiona goes back almost 5 years, running to many hundreds of messages at all hours of the day and night. I would be tempted to call her my co-author. A big thank you to Fiona. I hope she's watching. Some of you may have heard about what's known as bar jokes. A man went into a bar. Well, I wouldn't talk about a joke with a man going into a bar. But what I do want to say is a writer walked into a bar. No smiles from the audience, please. And the bar happened to be the Errigal Inn on the Ormer Road in Belfast. And if those of you with very good eyesight, can you see the name of the street? Very appropriately named street. It's called Jameson Street. When I was thinking about this slide last night, I was trying to figure out what came first, the street name or the bar, but anyway. And in that bar, there's a lounge. It's called the Oak Lounge. There's a small sign over to beside the red door. And the Oak Lounge has got a nice, there's a lovely carpeted pathway into the Oak Lounge. And on the wall, there's a framed poster. And the poster is about things from the Ormer Road area, things of interest from the Ormer Road area. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a small circle. I was drawn to it because of, I would call it was using UN blue. But it's the Ulster History Circle has got this commemorative plaque. And it's to Seán Lester, who lived on the Ormer Road for 20 years, number 164. And when I looked at that, I have to say, there were shivers going up my spine. It was really, it knocked me out when I saw this. Coming from more than 20 years working with the UN system, knowing a bit about Seán Lester, but I never knew that he lived in Belfast. I lived on the Ormer Road area for 12 years. I never knew about this. And not only that, since my retirement, I go to a writers group in the Ballinafy Creative Writers Circle. And we meet every Wednesday afternoon in the Ormo Library. So you can imagine the sensation that this gave to me. And it really got me thinking about, first of all, about Seán Lester. As writers, we often talk about a trigger that gets you started to write something. Well, this emphatically was my trigger. It triggered an eagerness, and I would say a near obsession, for me to find out more about Mr. Lester. I came across some biographies. I went immediately to the, can I say, the authorized biography of Seán Lester. It's the last Secretary General, Seán Lester and the League of Nations. The author was Douglas Gageby, quite a well-known journalist in Ireland. He was also the editor of the Irish Times, Ireland's premier newspaper, on 2 occasions, believe it or not. What's not known very well is that he married Dorothy Lester. He married the oldest daughter of Seán Lester. So he was the son-in-law, and he wrote the authorized biography. The second book that I looked at was the ILO book that came out in 2009, the ILO and Edward Phelan and the ILO. But what I discovered about these 2 books was an interesting thing. Oh, just go back. I'm ahead of myself. The Douglas Gageby book had occasional references to Seán Lester. Not a lot. And that got me thinking. And the ILO book on Phelan had a few references to Lester. So my thinking started to zero in not just on Lester, but on the relationship between the 2 of them. There wasn't a lot in the public domain, so I had some work to do there. Where did my book fit in? Well, it's not just about the Gageby Lester biography, and it's not just about the ILO Phelan biography. And I also say it's not actually a history book or a book on international relations. It's a book about two personalities, two quite celebrated Irishmen. It's a human interest story. It looks at the life and times of Phelan and Leicester. They were both born in 1888, so immediately I was thinking, that's something that's of interest. Their interwoven careers and their interpersonal relations. In the advanced publicity for this event, Dorothea sent around a message, and she said, in Gerry Finnegan's entertaining book. And I thought, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted people to see it as a human interest story, something to enjoy, not a heavy historical tome. But of course, there were massive backdrops during the period when Leicester and Phelan were alive. 2 world wars, the Paris Peace Conference, and the Treaty of Versailles, the new Russia emerging after the workers' revolutions of 1917, the creation of the ILO and the League of Nations, and the growth of multilateralism, the partition of Ireland, and the birth of the Irish Free State. The San Francisco Conference of 1945, the Conference on International Organization, which created the United Nations. And then following that, the onset of the Cold War. So my research journey, first of all, within Ireland, it took me to Belfast Central Library, which opened in 1888. And they've actually invited me to give a talk next month because of they picked up the 1888 date of birth of Leicester and Phelan. And the lovely thing about Leicester, he and his late brother became big fans of the Central Library, and they learned so much about Irish culture by going there. University College Dublin, where I did my first degree, the archives there were very helpful. Dublin City University. And I write there that research can damage your health. I suffer from asthma. And I went to the DCU archives, and I was handling these very precious 100-year-old documents. And this is before COVID. I wasn't wearing a face mask. And about 2 days later, I came down with a very bad bout of asthma. So my lesson for you all is research can damage your health. I came to Geneva. I connected with the ILO archives. I also went to the Palais des Nations and found out about the very valuable resources at the UN Office of Geneva. I visited Bellevue and Jonto. I lived here for 6 years, and I lived in Bellevue/Jonto. And I visited the church where Phelan was buried from, St. Rita's Church. I visited the cemetery where he's buried. My younger daughter went to school in Jonto Primary School. The cemetery is just at the back. And also the villa where Phelan lived along by the lakeside. By way of what we might call field visits, I went to Carrickfergus, just north of Belfast. And I went looking for the place where Seán Leicester was born. By the way, he was born as John Ernest Leicester. I went to attended a talk at the Carrickfergus Civic Centre, where it was called Sticking to the Seat, which was a story about how Seán Leicester stuck to his seat in Geneva when the world was crumbling around him. I went to Connemara in County Galway, where Leicester and his family had a house in Clifton, first of all, and then they moved to the village of Recess. And actually, Seán Leicester died from Recess and is buried in Clifton at the Christchurch Cemetery. And I went to the southeast of Ireland, to Waterford, to look at Cheek Point Village, where Edward Phelan spent his early, quite memorative and important years. You've already heard the 10th of September 1923 was the date when Ireland joined the League of Nations and automatically joined the International Labour Organization. That was a condition. Members of the League automatically became members of the ILO, but there was no reciprocal arrangement. The ILO had been, and the League of Nations had been based in Geneva since 1920. And Phelan had been a major figure on the diplomatic scene in Geneva. First of all, he was the third ranking official in the ILO. But then he, along with others, created what was known as the International Club of Geneva. And he was unanimously elected as the first president. He also became president of the private sector group. So he was the big man. He was the important man in Geneva at that time. Ireland had aspirations to join the new Irish government, had aspirations to join the League of Nations. And they appointed a Cork man, Michael McWhite. They appointed him as their representative in Bern. And he came to Geneva, did a round of courtesy calls, and he met with the ILO general at the time, Albert Thomas. Thomas introduced him to Edward Phelan. They'd never met before. And McWhite wrote back to Dublin, and he said the ILO director had presented to him an Irishman of outstanding ability in the person of Edward Phelan, whose vast and comprehensive knowledge enabled him to coordinate the different services of Britain, France, and other continental countries. Now you know what the third-ranking ILO official was doing. And following that event, a delegation from Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, went to Paris, and they were participating in a conference on the Irish race that was organized by the Irish Republican Association of South Africa. Obviously, Phelan had been informed about this event. The meeting was in Paris. It was at the tail end of the Treaty of Versailles. And Phelan persuaded his boss, the director, Albert Thomas, to go to Paris to meet the Irish delegation. And that, for Phelan, was a groundbreaking meeting. It was the first time that he'd met with people in the new Irish independence movement. And he gave them a promise. He pledged to them his informal support as they moved forward with their plans to join the League of Nations, mainly the League of Nations initially. After they had successfly been elected to the League of Nations in September 1923, a member of the delegation, Owen McNeill, a County Antrim man, he was Minister of Education, and he was part of that delegation. And he put on record, he said, I've gone too quickly here. Can you put it back? He said, I must put on record the invaluable assistance received throughout the league session by Mr. Edward Phelan, who has a remarkable knowledge of European politics and politicians and of technical matters connected with the league. He was always watchful for the advantage for Ireland. His advice never failed us. So that was an acknowledgement coming from the Irish delegation about the important role that Phelan had played in helping them to get elected to the League of Nations. I want now to look at the two gentlemen because they met in 1929 whenever Seán Lester was appointed as Ireland's representative to the League of Nations. A snapshot of their lives pre-1929. They were both born as UK citizens in 1888. Phelan into a Catholic family in County Waterford. Lester into a Methodist Protestant family in County Antrim. They migrated with their families. Phelan moved to Liverpool, Lester to Belfast. Education, they were very different from the point of view of education. Phelan did 2 degrees at Liverpool University and got a diploma in French. Lester left Methodist College in Belfast at the age of 14. He learned Irish and later changed his name, as I said, to Seán Lester. Phelan, from between 1911 and 1914, he did what I would call a bit of job swapping. He was a researcher, he was a teacher, and he worked as a travel guide. Lester was mainly a journalist, and he rose to become the chief news editor of the Freeman's Journal. Phelan volunteered to join the British Army for World War I. But he didn't enlist. Because he was working in the government service, he was deemed to be ineligible for military service. So he never took up arms. Lester, on the other hand, joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He did arms training, but he never took up, he was never involved in military action. He was stood down before what we call the Easter Rising of 1916. Phelan joined the Ministry of Labour in the UK government as a British civil servant between 1914 and 1919. And Seán Lester joined the Department of External Affairs as an Irish civil servant between 1923 and 1929. Phelan and Lester were very different characters. Phelan was seen as being a high-level international diplomat who happened to have been born in Ireland. He was also seen as an academic who had a bit of a legal mind when it came to poring over documents. He was ambitious. He was aloof and sought and admired intellectuals for company. He wasn't at ease, even within the ILO. He wasn't at ease with the lower levels. And somebody wrote that he was known as a cold fish. Lester, on the other hand, he was an Irish official, a diplomat with the Department of External Affairs. He was a journalist, and he had been interested in stories and lives about people. He had an easygoing manner, and he was a good mixer, sorry. In fact, he never applied for any of the major jobs that came his way. He was singled out. He was handpicked to lead various jobs, handpicked to come to Geneva, handpicked for various other appointments. And in fact, he and his wife used to sit and look at each other and say, why me? What is it about me? Why am I being called on to do these jobs? Phelan had a live-in partner, Fernand. He married her in 1940. Phelan actually wrote nothing about his partner, his wife. On the other hand, Lester was a family man. He had 3 daughters, and he was incredibly romantic. And even in his writing, in his journals, he wore his heart on his sleeve, remembering anniversaries and birthdays and so on. The career paths of Phelan and Lester, there were some differences and some similarities. Phelan, as you know, became chief of the diplomatic division in 1920. In 1933, he applied to become Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations, and he wasn't successful. But he did become assistant director of the ILO. In 1938, he applied to become the ILO director, but decided to stand down and didn't pursue his candidature. But he did, as they say, as a reward for him standing down, he got a position as deputy director of the ILO. He became acting director of the ILO in 1940 and director general retroactive. He was made director general in 1948. Leicester, on the other hand, he moved to Geneva in 1929 as Ireland's representative to the League. In 1934, the League appointed him as High Commissioner to the Free City of Danzig. He was there for 3 years. In 1937, after he'd finished his tour in Danzig, he came back to Geneva and he was appointed Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations. In 1940, whenever Joseph Avenel, the Director General, the Secretary General of the League of Nations, resigned, Leicester became the acting Secretary General. And in 1946 was appointed Secretary General, retroactive to 1940. The important thing about those dates for me is that they were both acting number twos in 1938 or 1937. They were both acting in those positions. And whenever wartime came, they then assumed the positions of being the acting heads of the agencies. In my research, I had a lot of difficulty trying to find photographs of the two gentlemen together. I tried everywhere. The only photograph I could find was of them on a skiing holiday. And the quality of it is very poor. I had to copy it from Douglas Gageby's photograph from his book. And on the left is Edward Phelan. Next to him is Seán Leicester. And to the right, extreme right, is Fernand Phelan. And beside that is Elsie Leicester. A very interesting thing about Phelan, he was known for always wearing a bow tie, even when he went skiing. Here we have the official portraits of Phelan and Leicester. Phelan's normally hanging in the ILO building, and Leicester is normally hanging at the Palais. At the end of the Second World War, the United Nations came into being. I meant to check with Carrie about the pronunciation of Trígéavlé, but is that acceptable?
Yeah, good.
The first Secretary General of the United Nations from Norway. And in fact, he offered a position to Seán Leicester to head up the Border Commission when they were drawing up the border between India and Pakistan. He said he had very busy commitments and he was sorry he wasn't able to take it up. And his daughter chipped in and said it was the fishing season. But also, just to show the bond that continued between Leicester and Phelan, when Leicester had met with the Secretary General, the Secretary General said, you know, I have heard that Edward Phelan has been in New York and he didn't come in to see me. Could you tell him I'd like to see him? So Leicester was able to pass that message on to Phelan. Phelan turned up in New York, met the Secretary General, and there we have them signing the declaration, because the ILO became the first specialized agency of the UN system. I want to just sum up what Guy Ryder had said about Edward Phelan. This was at the Edward Phelan Memorial Lecture that was held in the College of Surgeons in Dublin in 2013. Although one can see Phelan as a pure product of the British Civil Service, he was deeply Irish. He brought his personal talent and industry to the new task of international cooperation at around the same time when Ireland emerged as an international actor on the world scene. And the ILO was and has remained one of the stages on which this Irish art of combining national sovereignty with global interdependence can excel. The links between the family continued. The Leicester's middle daughter, she actually came to Geneva to keep Seán Leicester company during the war years, and she continued her education in Geneva. She ended up getting a job in the ILO. She worked in the ILO standards department for 30 years, from 1948 until 1978. She was known as Anne Leicester Gorski. And as I say, she was working in the standards department. As recently as July 1986, she was on holiday in Ireland and sent a postcard back to Phelan. Both Seán Leicester and Edward Phelan had passed away at this stage, but the links were still there. And she was obviously taken by this heraldic shield of the Phelan family. And she sent that postcard to Fernand in Geneva. Although it was sent from Ireland, I'm sure you'll notice there's a British stamp on it. No comment. Their final residences. Phelan remained, when he came back from Montreal, he remained at the villa on Lake Geneva, and his passion was for yachting. Leicester settled in Connemara, and his last residence was in Recess. And his house, it's a pity it just doesn't show the little lake that's facing the house, but he had the fishing rights for Glendalough Lake at Recess. Their final resting places for Seán Leicester at Christchurch Cemetery in Clifton, alongside his wife and his daughter Dorothy and his son-in-law Douglas Gageby, biographer. In Jonto, Edward Phelan is buried alongside his wife in Jonto Cemetery. I couldn't help but remark that these two prestigious characters, that they end up with very, very modest slabs. A slab of stone for Seán Leicester, a slab of marble for Edward Phelan. Nobody knows the incredibly rich and powerful lives that they lived, important lives that they lived. Gone but not forgotten. Well, almost. As I've said to you, the blue plaque exists in Belfast on the Ormer Road. When I gave my talk in Belfast, a lot of people said, I travel up and down the Ormer Road so often, and I've never noticed that plaque, or I've seen the plaque, but I didn't know what it meant. However, there's no reference to Seán Leicester in Dublin. There is reference to him in Gdansk. The meeting room in the Gdansk City Council is now, as of about 10 years ago, it's been renamed the Seán Leicester Meeting Room. And as regards Edward Phelan, whenever his Fernand passed away, the estate bequeathed a significant sum of money to the National University of Ireland. And one of the things that they've done with it is, well, they named the boardroom in Merrion Square as the Edward and Fernand Phelan boardroom. Sorry about that. And they've also instigated a biennial Edward Phelan Memorial Lecture. And the first one was given by Guy Ryder as DG, as he was at the time. The second one was given by President Michael D. Higgins in 2015. The third one by Professor Mary Daly. And the last one was given by the current Taoiseach, who was the Taoiseach, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, back in 2022. So one thing I need to fill in is that when I was based in Geneva from 2000 until 2006. I was also instrumental in bringing together the ILO and Irish Aid into a partnership program. It was a multi-year partnership program and a multi-dollar program as well that supported my work on women's entrepreneurship, but supported work on forced labor and so on. And now the final bit, how to get my book. There's a brochure. I hope you've all been able to pick up a copy of the brochure. But you see that I encourage people to buy it from order it from their local bookstore. Or you can, if you scan the QR, it takes you to my publisher and you can order a copy from them. And finally, it's on Amazon. I have a few books with me. I'm not permitted to sell them, but I will be in Charlie O'Neill's from about 6 o'clock onwards, if anybody would like a copy. And with that, I want to thank you all.
Thank you very much, Gerry. This was really, there's reading the book is one thing, but listening to such a talk is another thing. So this was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now I hand over to Carrie.
Thanks. Thank you, Dorothea. I mean, Gerry has done an admirable job in tracing the personal and professional history of both Edward Phelan and Seán Lister, up to the point they get together in this new multilateral hub of Geneva. What I found very interesting is the early life of both of these, which, of course, we usually don't read about so much in the history books. Then Gerry explains the intertwined history of the League and the ILO, which, in a way, which also furnishes valuable information on the new Irish membership in both. There's a lot of detail and good information. Phelan and Lister certainly came from different backgrounds, and their starting points were different when they got into the different positions in their organizations. Phelan had practically created the ILO. Was in his thesis on the United States and the ILO, Daniel Patrick Moynihan has a little footnote where he tells about interviewing Phelan in 1951. And he had asked Phelan that, well, who actually got the idea of the ILO? And Phelan answers, that's simple, I did. So it's, then Moynihan even checked this from John Shotwell, who was one of those present at the time, who said that, yes, that is true. It was the Gaelic imagination of Phelan combined with the British officials' history and knowledge that actually produced the ILO. Still, both Phelan and Lister had to wait their time before they became number one in their organizations, and even still only acting. Phelan had to wait until Butler and then Wynant before he was trusted to run the organization. Lister became active head almost by default, and certainly through no ambition of his own. He was a good man needed in a difficult place, and he had gone through all the frustrations already in Danzig, which Gerry describes. So he was well prepared for at least the difficulties he was confronted with. Both had a deep allegiance and support to the new Ireland, whose integration in international organizations they facilitated. And both experienced frustration when the response from Dublin was less than enthusiastic on occasions. Then their careers differed. When the ILO went to exile in Montreal, and Seán Lister got stuck in Geneva. By that time, as has been noted, both were acting, and they had to remain acting, as there was no authority in the wartime in their organizations to confirm them in their positions. They must have had much to talk with one another upon seeing one another again in Montreal in May 1945. Just reading the book, so one of my questions to Gerry here is there really no record of their discussion, of the contents of their discussion by either of them? Because I would suppose, and it comes out from the book, it must have been a friendly chat, not an outpouring of some frustrations, which actually would certainly have been warranted by the fate that they had been thrown in due to what had happened to their respective organizations. But the story that Gerry tells is, despite serious problems and divergent interests, friendship between the two won the day. Reading it, it does make me did make me feel a bit sorry for the South African treasurer of the League of Nations, Jacqueline, who had to deal with the finances of both. So he must have had a fairly schizophrenic life at certain times. When I was looking at this last and just thinking of what else to say today, I noted that I think that it's important to see why it came to this. Lloyd George in the early 20s was right when he actually said, I think to Albert Thomas, that the absence of the United States might prove to be fatal for the League. Phelan could compensate for this. The ILO was not in a terribly good position in 1933, after also Germany pulled out, but Phelan succeeded, and Phelan and his colleagues, they succeeded in getting the United States to join the ILO in 1934. The US did not join the League. The Soviet Union actually joined both the League and the ILO the same year, but it was not a happy experience. It had no happy experience in either of them. In the League, the Soviet membership ended with the geopolitical maneuvers that had led Stalin to attack Finland in 1939, and so the Soviet Union was expelled. Was the expulsion simply only due to Avenel? Because Gerry mentions Avenel's role in it. I have actually an assumption that the Finnish government of the day had something to do with it also, because they were rallying international support in 1939 a little bit in the same way as Ukraine has done recently. In any case, by the time the Soviet Union had come to a point where it had de facto terminated its participation in the ILO because it was tired of the consistent attacks of the employers group against Soviet managers. The appointment of Soviet managers to represent Soviet employers. Actually, the employers wanted to go to the permanent Permanent Council of International Justice in 1938 to have a ruling on whether the Soviet Union met the criteria of tripartism, but the governing body voted that proposal of going to the International Court down in 1938. But why did Phelan's ILO succeed, where Leicester's League was actually rather ingloriously swept away? With the conference, the special conference that Phelan had succeeded in organizing in 1941 in New York City, he had he had kept the ILO alive as an organization of its constituents, whereas the League did not have this alive presence of its members. And Phelan explains that in his own memoirs rather well, saying that if an organization does not have physical meetings of its constituents over a certain number of years, it simply withers away. Phelan had organized that. The League, again, remained paralyzed, as Leicester's correspondence shows, and his attempts to even get properly the attention of the chair of the from Hambro from his administration. But the ILO had two mighty supports. It had its constituents, employers and the workers, and it had the United States. You know, ever since 1919, Franklin D. Roosevelt had actually played the role of a guardian angel for the ILO, even though the US did not join the ILO in the beginning, because in 1919, when Phelan was looking for space in Washington, D.C., for the Secretariat, for the first conference, it was the Assistant Secretary of Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who actually acquired those offices for him. So you see Roosevelt already looming at an early stage, supporting the ILO. Then there was the effect of the New Deal and the appeal, in a way, that tripartism had for the New Deal. There was membership of the US in 1934. Phelan had to give way to Winant. Phelan might have wanted to become director after Butler, but as the Americans came in, so Winant came in. Winant did one thing. He saved the ILO with the decision of relocation to Montreal. If there's one thing that the ILO can thank Winant for, it was this decision, which of course then was carried out, executed, and taken further by Phelan. The conference in 1941, the special conference of the ILO, ended up by a session with Roosevelt in the White House. Roosevelt also had the ILO throughout in his plans for the new United Nations. There's in the International Labour Review, was in 1949 an article by Phelan, where Phelan tells how Roosevelt had with him the blueprints of the UN during the 1943 conference in Tehran, and ILO was included in it. But at that moment, he chose not to take it up with Stalin because the Soviet Union still had rather deep distrust towards this organization, which had all these private employers in it. Now, after the war, the ILO won over Soviet designs to give its functions to the ECOSOC, and the ILO became the first specialized agency of the UN. But I'd just like to finish by pointing out that the League of Nations certainly was not a failure. And it is I mean, somehow it carries the stigma of having failed. But actually, it was a garden of many multilateral initiatives, such as health, refugees, agriculture, education and culture. And all of these, after 1945, led to their own specialized agencies and programs. And Lester tried to remind in one of his radio talks to the US, he tried to remind of this role of the League, that the League is not only the political superstructure, but there's a lot of work that is being done. But for the League, the political took over the technical, and unfortunately sank the League. The ILO could maintain a balance, let's say, of the technical and the political, which has been the salvation of the ILO since that. But Gerry, it's a great book.
Thank you, Harry, for these important remarks, which really show the Irish influence.
Yeah.
And end with a positive message. And now I would like to invite Remo to not only talk, but to show us.
So I was asked to present some of the ILO treasures. So I won't show any picture. Next slide. I won't show any document regarding Phelan while he was assistant director. Next. I won't show any picture of files of the people of the time where he was acting director or director general of the ILO. Next. I will present two treasures. They are here. So I'm happy Ambassador has left. This is Phelan's passport from 1918 to 1921. It was handed over to the archives when Edward Phelan passed away in 1967. So you have a picture of Phelan in 1918. Next slide. And you can see the actual passport is a very large document around it's larger than an A3 page, as you can see, with all the stamps. So for instance, on that page, you can see that you have on the top, on the right angle, you have the military precinct in Paris in 1919. You have below his travel to Russia, 1918. If you go to the next page, next slide, You can see endorsement traveling to Russia via Narvik, Sweden. Norway and Norway and Sweden. You have Visa Paris, etc. Next slide. His picture, his photograph in 1919 with the stamps of the Genoa Conference in 1920 on the right-hand side, and many other. You have the visa for Switzerland in 1921. And so this is a quite valuable treasure handed over when he passed away. Go to the next. Second treasure, this little book, AGP, Edward Phelan, 1919, 1948. Next slide. So the member of the staff of the International Labour Office, whose signature follow, hope that Edward Phelan will accept this gift in memory of the 29 years which he devoted to the International Labour Organization. And then if you turn the page, so next slide, you get the staff, starting with the elected, the DG-elect, David Morse. You have the assistant directors of that time. You have the legal advisor, Wilfried Jenks. And then you have his cabinet on the next picture. And then followed by all ILO staff. So it's a very silent but efficient testimony of ILO and a DG and the way they thanked him for all the years he spent in the ILO. And this is unique. I mean, it's the only time that we got this. No other director general got this little gift. So I hope that you just enjoyed these two treasures. It's the first time, I guess, that you can see these two treasures. So thank you. By the way, somewhere in the book, you have Anne Lester, who also signed because she was already serving the ILO in 48.
Thank you very much, Raymond. That really fascinating. I didn't know that you have these two treasures in your archives. Alessandro, do we have any questions in our chat box? Because I think we can have 5 more minutes at least to see if there are also then questions from our audience. But first, let us see.
First of all, congratulations, Gerry. Very interesting presentation. And there's many more congratulations in the chat and thank you notes and more congratulations. There is one question. If you could elaborate on if you've drawn on the works of both Phelan and Lester throughout your career at the ILO, and if you could give any examples. You've already mentioned your role in the Irish Aid support for women. Are there any other such examples is what they're asking? Do you have any other examples of drawing from the influence of both Lester and Phelan in your work and your career in the ILO?
Sorry, I can't think of any offhand. I just added in my own personal situation when I was based at the headquarters. One of the things that I was adamant about is that when we were working on activities relating to women entrepreneurs, that we would try to go to countries that were part of the Irish Aid program. So we linked in with Ethiopia, we linked in with Zambia, and so on, so that Irish Aid could see what ILO was doing with Irish funding. So we're trying to bring that whole relationship closer together. But I don't have any other examples. Sorry.
I would like to ask you a question. When you read the book, I have the feeling your personal sympathy is rather with Seán Lester. Is this true?
I've been caught out. Well, in Ireland, we call people from the north, we call them Nordies. And he, like me, he's from the north of the country. But as you know, from what I've been explaining, he adopted the Irish language. He became bilingual. I've been trying to brush up on my Irish recently. But yeah. Many commentators have spoken about Phelan and said that he was a bit of a cold fish. And he had a very legal mind. Although he was not trained as a lawyer. In fact, if he saw something that had to be acted on, I describe in the book, he was like a terrier dog who would grab onto the trouser leg and not let go of it. And this happened on one occasion when he, as an international civil servant, was trying to persuade the government to take sanctions against Britain because of some injustice that he had seen. And eventually he was told by the legal advisor to the president, he was told, Mr. Phelan is not right on this. But he was hanging on to these little things. I called him, he was certainly an advocate for Ireland, but he was also a polemicist. He was throwing ideas out there when other people hadn't really thought about them. And I read his journal articles. He wrote quite a number of journal articles for an Irish quarterly called Studies, very original name, but there's a longer title to it. It's a Jesuit quarterly. And some of the stuff that he wrote was quite fabulous. I mean, it stands the test of time. It was comments on the birth of the ILO and the birth of the League of Nations, but the differences between them, that the ILO was more of a practical organization, whereas the League of Nations was more about agreements and arrangements and treaties and so on. The thing that maybe highlights the difference is that there was a trade union official he was a Belfast man, who moved to Dublin, and he came to Geneva for the unveiling of the statue of Albert Thomas. He was a trade unionist, but he met with Seán Lester. And because the trade unionist was from Belfast and Lester was from Belfast, the two of them had a great interaction. And I wrote in the book, it would have been interesting to see how Phelan would have interacted with this trade unionist. He was very outspoken. And I was imagining even that Seán Lester in his role was probably slightly envious that the trade unionists could call things as they were, whereas Lester still had to be a bit diplomatic. But Lester, when you read his journals, they're full of all sorts of little anecdotes. Whenever Phelan was in Montreal, Lester looked in on the Phelan residence, and he wrote to Phelan and he said, I checked in on your house, I fed the animals and I spoke to them, and they all ran away from me, And there were talks. I was sitting in the archives here in Geneva, and I was reading official correspondence. And I'm not sure whether Jacques heard me, but sometimes I was reading the correspondence. I was bursting out laughing because of the interactions between the two of them. But a lot of the humor was coming from more from Lester than from Phelan. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so
I was trying to be a diplomat.
Yeah. So my impression that a little bit your heart was more or is more with Lester was correct.
Well, it's from the Armour Road as well.
Good. Is there any other important question? Because I think we have little by little reached the end of this afternoon together. I would like to give the possibility to you who are here. Would you like to contribute, or do you have a special a question to ask to Gerry.
You just touched upon.
Can you use the microphone, please? In the big one.
Um, I have often asked myself the subject you touched upon, did Seán Lester speak Irish Gaelic? And you said he was bilingual, and it's very possible that he spoke the language, but there was one incident when he was in Danzig. The Archbishop of Danzig had Irish ancestry. His name was Edvard O'Reilly. And he proposed to visit Leicester, and Leicester wrote in his diary, I was very alarmed in case he wished to speak Gaelic, which seems to suggest that he wasn't as fluid in Gaelic as he might have been.
Well, he did in the 1921 census of Belfast. He was registered as bilingual, you know. So, and he, as a journalist, he signed his articles sometimes as Seán McLeistor. So the full, it wasn't just changing it from John Ernest to Seán, but the family name as well. And I would also, John, I wanted to mention you in my talk, but I didn't. John also wrote a very interesting, co-authored a very interesting book on Seán Lester. And we've been in contact for the past few years, but more recently, since Sunday, believe it or not, we've been passing emails back and forward. But I'm delighted you could make it here today, John. Thank you.
I do have a second question that you might. A second question that you might find impossible to answer. Why did Seán Lester not write his memoirs?
Because he thought nobody would be interested. He was very unassuming. And because it did come up, there was a question asked, why didn't you, he was being proposed as the president of Ireland for the first time there was a president of Ireland. And what his answer to that was, well, they would never pick me because I'm a Protestant. Well, he got that wrong because the first president of Ireland was a Protestant, Dr. Douglas Hyde. But yeah. Sorry.
I think there was one word which was very often in the book is that Seán Lester was very modest.
Yes, yeah.
As a personality. And I think this is probably the answer. I think a certain degree of modesty prevents you from writing your memoirs, just because you don't think that your life is so overwhelmingly important that you have to write a book about it. And this is certainly, for me, also what makes him, in a way, sympathetic. On the other hand, I mean, we have with Phelan, of course, somebody was very dynamic, and we all wouldn't be here if we hadn't had Phelan at the right moment in this specific difficult situation to make sure that the ILO survives. So, so interesting models also for the younger generation. Keeps you thinking in what direction to go more. It's a question of personality in the end. I think we have to. There's another question. Great.
Thank you. Well, my name is Ita Margie. I am Irish, and I'm very interested in this story. And I have written up myself a little, not professionally in any way, about both men in my own style and simple texts that have been published on and around. I've left the ILO 23 years ago, so I'm 23 years into retirement after almost 30 years. So my point now is this: I'm always interested in keeping the ILO spirit alive, this tripartitism. Is very deep in me, you know, and I'm just wondering about this particular session, whether it wouldn't be interesting to get an archival record of this session. And I think that that might be an idea that I would throw out, being a very practically minded person. And I say that not just for me, but for the upcoming generation, even serving staff, to be able to just to know what is the history about these two people. and also the nascence of the organization. And actually, I think to some extent as a lesson about what the ILO is really all about. And that tripartisan message, I think, hasn't gone very deep. I felt it while I was serving. I really did. And I've been gone 23 years. So I can't speak for the generation that have followed me, but just as a very practical suggestion. I don't know how the archivists would feel about that, because I think there's so much that's come out about this, and the ILO, and even the League, the history of the League. I had to read about the League of Nations myself once I actually retired and found out all about that too. So as a practical suggestion, if it could be accepted, I'd be very, very pleased.
Thank you very much for this suggestion, which already came, I think, via email or on Facebook. I don't remember. We have recorded this session, and the question is now, can we keep the records in the archives? No, I think they shouldn't. These days should not be a problem. So that because there are also a few colleagues who want to watch it. I think Fiona actually said she wants to watch it once it's available.
1 day, 2 hours of working time. I don't know, physical independence. I would really like to.
Okay, it's well noted. I just want to say that we also have really good research on the ILO, and I'm totally with you. Tripartism is something which could be taught more actively also to new officials, but we have a good solid base of material and publications now on ILO history, which is also shared with the new colleagues. I mean, this is also a little bit what I'm doing when they get a training in Turin. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I know we're running out of time, but just to very quickly say, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to, first of all, the ambassador sends his apologies. He had to dip out early, although, like you said, I think if he'd seen that passport, he might have got his scissors out, because we clip the corners these days on cancelled passports. But just to say congratulations on the book, and to thank you very much for inviting us here today. It's been interesting, it's been engaging, very entertaining. I think if the book is half as entertaining as today has been, then it'll be a great read. So I will buy my own copy. I won't steal the ambassadors. I will read it. I just wanted to say as well, as you mentioned, it is a very timely time for this to be published, not just for the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in, but also that this year marks 100 years since Ireland joined the League of Nations. So the centenary was there just a few weeks ago on the 10th of September. And just, it might be of interest to everyone, if you'll allow me this little plug, we're actually having an event at the Palais des Nations called On an Equal Footing with All Ireland at the League of Nations. So it's just an exhibition that marks kind of the first few years of Ireland as its own country at the League of Nations. And we're having the opening event on Tuesday, the 26th. So next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. You're all very welcome to join. We can send out any extra information anyone might need. But yeah, that was all. Just say thank you again for this and congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would love to attend, but I won't be here in Geneva next week. Maybe you record it? Yeah. Oh, okay, then I will come. Yes, great. Okay, and with this, Gerry, do you want to have some final words and then we end?
The comments that were made a few moments ago, they reminded me of a question that was asked of me a long time ago about the book. Why was I not going to write an ILO book? And the reason was because I wanted it to be a human interest story. I didn't want it to have to follow a particular party line or whatever. No disrespect to the ILO and the great publications that they have, but I wanted to have that freedom. And also the freedom by way of the length of time that it took me. It took me 6-7 years. I was quite ill at times. I had to take all my papers, put them in a box, put them away, because I couldn't get better and write at the same time. And anybody who does any writing, you can't write for 30 minutes and then leave it there and go back to it 4 days later. You have to be able to build up a head of steam. Yeah, the other thing, and it was touched on by Carrie, it's the role of the formidable woman in the American administration, a woman called Frances Perkins. And there's a fantastic biography written about her, and some of the detail comes out about the Tehran conference and the pieces of paper that were passed between the Russian leaders and the American leaders. But she was the first, as my understanding is, she was the first woman secretary in the American government, and she was Secretary of Labor, and she built up a very good rapport with Edward Phelan. And in fact, when he went on his mission to Washington in 1933, he went to see if America could become more involved in the ILO. And she was very supportive, acting as an interlocutor between President Roosevelt and the ILO. And 1 year later, the Americans joined the ILO. It's kind of referred to as the jewel in the crown of the ILO over the years. So that's, sometimes we, when I was writing the book, I wanted to find out more about Elsie Lester. I wanted to find out more about Fernand Phelan. And it was so hard to really dig out information about the two women. I got more on Elsie. She was quite a formidable woman. Her father was actually a very high-level unionist member of the Belfast Corporation. And their family, for a while, turned their back on Lester. Although he was born as John, the family referred to him as Jack, never Seán. And the expression that was passed around among the neighbours on the Antrim Road in Belfast was referring to Elsie's betrothed as Jack Lester, the Protestant gunman. So, but anyway, I would have liked to have been able to give a much more prominence to the women that come across in the book, but it really wasn't easy to get that information. I make those comments as well in my writing. Yeah.
So, thank you very much, Gerry. I really like this last remarks, because this was maybe the only criticism you have when you read it as a woman. You think, well, there is not much about the two. With this, I will end our afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you, Gerry. Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Remo. Have a good evening and hope to see you soon again at the ILO. Bye.